Eons ago, a volcano erupted under the sea. Piles of rocks and sheets of lava fell around the submerged volcano top. As centuries passed, millions of tiny coral creatures lived and died on the volcano's peak. They left behind countless shells which created new layers of sand and rock. Eventually, a 250-foot limestone cap covered the extinct volcano. With the coming of the Ice Age, the sea level lowered and exposed the mountaintop. The rock took shape. Rain, wind, and waves formed sand. The sand was blown by the wind into dunes. Rain mixed with dust to form soil. Thus the islands, known as Bermuda, were born out of the sea. The islands slept in the Atlantic Ocean. Who truly discovered Bermuda and when is not clear. But in 1511, a map published in an atlas included a place called La Bermuda. The Spanish claimed the island was discovered and named by one of their sailors, Juan de Bermudez. Although the Spaniards used the island as a navigational marker, they were never to stake their claim. Neither did the Portuguese, the French, or English. All had landed on the island. None remained to colonize it. Bermuda's reef-studded waters held scores of shipwrecks and was said to be cursed. Sailors called the place the Devil's Isle. A navigational hazard, Bermuda remained uninhabited throughout the 16th century. But fate was to change that. In the early 17th century, some Englishmen decided to send a relief fleet to help their colonists in Virginia. On June 2nd, 1609, 7 tall ships left Plymouth and set sail for the New World.
It was on the reefs off this point, now Fort St. Catherine, that the flagship Sea Venture was wrecked. A company of 150 men, women, and children survived and made their way ashore. The rest of the fleet, however, was lost. And so it was that the English arrived in Bermuda purely by chance, and the islands have been inhabited ever since. July the 28th is known as Summer's Day, in honor of Admiral Sir George Somers, the commander of the fleet and father of this colony.
Ironically, the establishment of law and order in Bermuda began with the wreck of the Sea Venture. The Merchant Marines Act regulated the conduct of both captain and crew on and off the water. Although Sir George, who was known as a lion at sea, had been in command on the water, he was forced to acknowledge Sir Thomas Gates, the designated deputy governor, as supreme commander ashore. This led to many disagreements between the two men. Sir George busied himself fishing for food and making a map of the islands, while Sir Thomas worried about getting off the rock. The company busied itself with survival, but the island was a virtual storehouse of plenty. In addition to wild hogs, there were turtles, fish, and a nearly tame seabird called the cahao. The castaways spent 10 months building 2 small vessels. They used leftover material salvaged from the Sea Venture and cut down cedar trees to make planks for the boat. Because they pinned their hopes on these tiny ships, they called one the Deliverance, the other the Patience.
This full-scale replica of the Deliverance, on exhibition here in St. George's, is a fascinating reminder of seafaring conditions of the 17th century. Loaded with provisions, she set sail for Jamestown with the Sea Venture survivors, leaving behind 3 men to maintain occupancy for the Virginia Company.
Somers and his crew reached Jamestown in less than 2 weeks, but the colony was in terrible shape. Only 60 people were alive. Most of the settlers had been killed by Indians or had starved to death. Instead of finding help, the Sea Venture's survivors became the rescuers of the colony. Sir George Somers decided to return to Bermuda for food and supplies. With his lodestone to guide him, he set sail again, but he was very sick, and once back in the island, he died. Sir George's body was returned to rest in the family vault, but according to his wishes, his heart was buried in Bermuda.
It's very fortunate that one of the Sea Venture survivors, William Strachey by name, sat down with pen in hand and wrote the story of a notable shipwreck, how the company had been saved and then survived on an uninhabited island. Indeed, there are those who say that William Shakespeare wrote his play The Tempest after hearing Strachey's story. In any case, the word soon spread through England about this Devil's Isle, and the Virginia Company decided that it would be in their best interest to colonize Bermuda.
At that point, Bermuda's first governor, Richard Moore, arrived with 50 settlers on the ship Plough in July 1612. Rumors that the Spanish under Philip IV were planning to reclaim Bermuda put Moore and his men quickly to work. For a small number of people, they accomplished a great deal and actually managed to build 8 or 9 forts in case the Spaniards came to take the island. But the uncharted reefs and channels that made the island hard to approach also made them easy to defend. Eventually, the Spanish did come, but when their 2 ships sailed into sight, the small garrison on Castle Island was ready. Alerted by smoke signals, Moore and his men fired 2 cannonballs as the invaders came into range. To their great surprise and relief, because there was only 1 shot left, the Spanish turned tail and sailed away. From then on, more ships came from England, bringing settlers and supplies and taking back anything from Bermuda they could. But the island faced lean years, meager crops, a rat problem, and hurricanes plagued the settlers. The island's poor showing as a commercial venture led to constant squabbles between the colonists and the sponsoring Virginia Company. In fact, the company sold its interest in Bermuda to an association chiefly composed of its own members. In 1614, this group gave Bermuda back to the Crown and recalled Moore to England. In 1615, the Somers Island, or Bermuda Company, as we shall call it, was incorporated and granted a charter by King James I. When the Bermuda Company received its title, the shareholders decided to have a coat of arms made. The seal showed a ship, like the Sea Venture, wrecked on the coast, and it bore the Latin words Quo fata ferunt, a quotation from Virgil's Aeneid, which means, wherever the fates do carry us.
1616 was a momentous year for Bermuda. The newly formed Bermuda Company sent its first governor to the island, and the ship Edwin arrived from the West Indies, carrying Bermuda's first black and Indian settlers. Their names are not recorded, but they were not necessarily slaves. It is therefore interesting to note that representatives of each of Bermuda's races was on the island early in the 17th century.
The new governor, Captain Daniel Tucker, was an energetic and difficult man. He arrived in the island full of plans and laden with silver-plated copper coins called hog money for the settlers, one of the earliest known forms of British colonial currency. Tucker had a reputation as a hard, strong man, and people soon discovered that he didn't hesitate to enforce his orders. The first Court of General Assize, or Court of Justice as we now know it, was held during Tucker's administration. But Governor Tucker did accomplish one great task. He arranged to have a remarkable man named Richard Norwood survey Bermuda and divide it into shares. The job took 2 years. Although many islands were kept as general land, the rest were divided into 8 tribes. Each tribe was named after a shareholder in England and contained 50 parts, or 400 shares of 25 acres each. These 8 tribes, together with St. George's, are today's 9 parishes. From the west end of the island, Sands, after Sir Edwin Sands. Southampton, after Henry Roxley, 3rd Earl of Southampton. Warwick, after Robert Rich, 2nd Earl of Warwick. Paget, after William Paget, 4th Lord Paget. Pembroke, after William Herbert, 3rd Earl of Pembroke. Devonshire, after William Cavendish, 1st Earl of Devonshire. Smiths, after Sir Thomas Smith. Hamilton, after James Hamilton, 2nd Marquis of Hamilton. St. George's, the only town for 200 years, and first settlement with the Somers coat of arms. Norwood's map has stood the test of time, but he made one mistake in dividing the land between Southampton and Sands. This became known as the Overplus Lane today, and the governor grabbed it as a personal reward. With all this taking place, people began to feel as though they were here for good. They began to plant and build stout homes for their children. They were settled. Bermuda was their country.
Bermuda was truly an island paradise before man. By 1620, only 11 years after settlement, the island had dramatically changed ecologically. Some damage had been done by the wild hogs, which the Spanish put ashore in the 1500s. These clumsy creatures trampled down the underbrush and hurt considerably the island's natural habitat. But man, with his civilized ways, was far worse.
It is said that the Bermuda archipelago has 365 islands, one for each day of the year. There are caves to be found all over the island, from large to small, and all remarkably beautiful. The shining stalactites reach down from the roof, and colorful stalagmites reach up from the floor. They are formed by drops of water seeping through the soil and stone, picking up minute quantities of material to leave as they trickle down to the floor. The cedar tree once covered the island with a cool green forest. The sturdy wood used for building homes, then in great demand for shipbuilding, was being decimated by the settlers. In the 1950s, an insect epidemic almost wiped out the tree. Efforts are being made to encourage the growth of this Bermudian treasure, but it is doubtful that the cedar will grace these shores again in such abundance. The slow-growing yellowwood tree and the palmetto were also to be found. The original Bermuda was almost without flowers. Most of the plants and flowers that grew here were wind-pollinated, not insect-pollinated. The blue Bermudiana, the wild prickly pear with its yellow flowers and pleasant-tasting red fruit, grew along the seashore, and the pretty maidenhair and the tough sword fern were early representatives among the grasses. The island's beauty came from the tremendous variety of greens to be seen, not from the splashes of color we know in the flowers of today. Bermuda had its share of regular visitors from the bird world, but two stood out. The first has become an island symbol. Natives and visitors alike look for the soaring black and white longtail sailing across the summer sky. A sadder story is that of the cahau, a seabird so named for the noise it made. The cahau nested on the island in enormous numbers, but because they raised their young in burrows on the ground, they were easy prey for man and other animals. They had no fear of man. Indeed, they seemed almost tame. Man killed them in such numbers that they were almost extinct by the mid-17th century. Bermuda has placed the cahau under strict protection, and the bird, with conservationists' guidance, is slowly emerging from the endangered lists. By far the most incredible sight to the settlers was the Bermuda fish. Rockfish, fast and sweet, hovered around the reefs. Brightly colored cowpollies, shy angelfish, schools of parrotfish swimming near the shore, and bonefish were among those commonly seen. It seems extraordinary to realize that just a few years after Bermuda became a colony, demand was overtaking the island's natural supply. But man was in a hurry to claim Bermuda, and with that came other forms of civilization as well.
By 1620, Bermuda had a new governor, Nathaniel Butler, a newly rebuilt church, St. Peter's, and a seemingly well-run company to guide them. It is important to realize that the relationship between church and state in 17th century Bermuda can, in most cases, be traced back directly to the company. Therefore, in examining one, the other comes up for scrutiny as well.
When the Virginia Company sent Governor Moore to Bermuda in 1612, the island officially pledged allegiance to the Church of England and erected St. Peter's Church. St. Peter's has a very special place in Bermudian history. It lays claim to being the oldest continuously used Christian church in the Western world and still manages to serve the spiritual needs of its parishioners today. Although the present structure dates from 1713, a complete restoration with a view toward preserving its authenticity was completed in the 1950s. The cedar altar is probably the oldest piece of cedar furniture in Bermuda, and it was known to have been in use by 1624. The pulpit has acquired a patina of age over the past 300 years, and the chalice, sent by the Bermuda Company and stamped with its seal in 1625, serves as a reminder of the powers that ran the church and the island. As churches throughout history, St. Peter's served the community for other functions as well.
Unhappily, religious turmoil and the growth of Puritanism in the mother country had their repercussions in Bermuda. Many people here had fled England to escape religious persecution, and with the growth of the Puritan or independent movement, a number of colonists actually renounced the church. The prayer book was discarded and the sacrament of Holy Communion neglected. As in England, the clergy were confused as to their political and ecclesiastical allegiance.
King Charles I had made himself unpopular by marrying a Roman Catholic and proved himself sympathetic to that point of view by appointing a man of similar views, Archbishop of Canterbury. The situation became impossible, and a civil war broke out with the king and his supporters against Parliament and its supporters. The war ended with the execution of the king and the declaration of a Commonwealth with Oliver Cromwell at its head. Those years, 1649 through 59, tried the church as if by fire. The news of the king's death horrified most Bermudians, and a miniature civil war broke out. The anti-Puritans called out the militia, who, led by John Trimmingham, marched on St. George's. There they ensured that fealty was sworn to the future king, Charles II, and replaced the company's governor with Trimmingham. The following year, after things were running more smoothly under Cromwell, the company replaced Trimmingham, and civil war ended. This turbulent period began to quiet after the Restoration and coronation of Charles II in 1660. But it was not until the end of the century that the Episcopalian character of the Church of England was restored.
While the church in Bermuda was undergoing change, so were government and the Bermuda Company. Officially, the colony's governor, representing the Crown and selected by the company, was the most powerful voice in the land. But Bermudians were never shy about speaking out, and at meetings, colonists could put forward their point of view and know that they would have a hearing. The first meeting of Parliament was held in St. Peter's Church, but Governor Butler decided that Bermuda needed a special building where Parliament could meet and court could be held.
Governor Butler's decision was to build a state house. Completed about 1622, the State House is the first stone building in Bermuda. Recently refurbished by the National Trust, it's not hard to picture the colonists, chosen from their parishes, meeting with the governor and his council to make laws. Laws which required plans for roads or for bridges between the islands, like the Somerset Bridge, probably the smallest drawbridge in the world. That first assembly in 1620 numbered 32 in all, and during the session, 32 acts were approved. Indeed, Bermuda has one of the oldest representative governments outside of the British Isles. But Bermuda's tiny size and remote location prevented the colony from being self-sufficient. Its course was largely determined by events and men beyond its shores. The Bermuda Company became a great source of aggravation to the settlers over time. Colonists were forbidden to trade with any ships other than the company's, and the company charged what it liked for the carriage of goods. There was continual friction over the efforts of London merchants to levy taxes on island trades. The company began to realize they would never see a profit from Bermuda. The great New England colonies and the colonization of Jamaica made Bermuda less important. The tobacco crop could not compete with the thousands of acres under cultivation in Virginia.
In a London courtroom in 1684, the company which had run Bermuda for 69 years was dissolved. After repeated petitions, the island was ceded back to the Crown. But it is a misnomer to call Bermuda a Crown colony, as the island has had its own assembly since 1620.
Although governors were sent out by the Crown, local affairs continued to be handled by Bermudians through the House of Assembly and the Legislative Council. This type of government served the colony well until it was changed to the present party system in 1968. 284 years later.
On becoming a royal colony, Bermuda was one of the poorest outposts of the British Empire, with a debt left by the company of £828. Bermudians were delighted to be free of the company's restrictive rule, but found that greater freedom meant greater responsibility. As a result, Bermudians were forced to look to the sea for their livelihood.
The Bermudians' one great asset was the local cedar, which grew in abundance on the island. It furnished the timber for houses, the wood for furniture, but above all, it was the substance of shipbuilding. 1/3 of the population was always afloat, and most of those ashore were involved in some type of maritime business. It wasn't long before black and white Bermudian crews were setting sail to seek some kind of trade. And in 1678, the adventurers came upon the Turks Islands. The place was ideal for making salt, a precious commodity in those days when fish and meat could only be preserved by using it. They quickly realized the possibilities of trading in salt and declared the island a colony of Bermuda. Salt gave the island economic relief and a product to trade for those at home. On the island, families depended on small boats for transportation from one island to another. Two distinctive types of boats were developed: dinghies up to 16 feet in length, which could be rowed or sailed, and larger decked sailing sloops for heavier work. While the dinghies were used in harbors or protected waters, the sloops could go offshore. It was only natural that Bermudian sailors, who had quite a reputation for being industrious on the water, but lazy on land, should seek other forms of adventure besides salt raking. Although the island has never become a base for piracy, it's worth remembering that some old Bermudian homes, like Spithead, were built from the prizes of privateering. It's no wonder that salt, cedar, and sailors summed up the way of life for most Bermudians.
This graveyard at St. Peter's Church holds the remains of a shadowed past. Slaves were permitted to be buried only in this section. Slavery came to an end with emancipation on 1st of August, 1834. After that time, the baptismal registry merely stopped indicating the status of a child. All were free. But slavery in Bermuda was a peculiar institution.
Unlike the West Indies or the Southern American colonies, Bermuda had no large plantations. Therefore, there were no large groups of men, women, and children under the control of one estate or family. By 1670, the government was trying to stop people from importing slaves because they were not necessary on a small island with an economy based on sailing and shipbuilding. However, slave ownership was widespread, and before the colony was 20 years old, slavery was part of the island's way of life. Slaves either did household work or learned a trade, such as shipbuilding or masons and carpenter's work. Many slaves were sent to sea in Bermuda's merchant fleet. Slaves did not all come from Africa. Some came from the West Indies, and white indentured servants were imported as a result of Cromwell's victory over the Irish. These indentured servants were bound to work for a set number of years to work off their passage. Relations between the master and slave were not always smooth. There were 3 potential uprisings in the 17th century. The first was in 1629. The second, according to old records, was a plot for an uprising in 1656. During this period, relationships between the races deteriorated, with fear demonstrated on one side and resentment on the other. Slaves were restricted to their masters' houses at night and were threatened with banishment to Eleuthera. A third confrontation came to a head on Christmas Eve, 1673, when 6 men were ordered to undergo severe physical punishment in an attempt to teach others a lesson. Meanwhile, the assembly had begun to refer to Negroes as mulattoes, testimony to the fact that miscegenation was already a fact of life.
Although St. George's was for nearly 2 centuries Bermuda's only town, the rest of the colony was quickly inhabited as settlers spread out over the 9 parishes. The architecture of our islands is our single most enduring tradition, as the basic forms of buildings, use of materials, and methods of construction were mainly established in the 17th century.
As with most things, Bermuda's architecture developed through trial and error. Early structures had stockade-type cedar post walls and a palmetto-thatched roof. Other houses were made from wattle and daub. The first stone building was the State House, but it wasn't until the last quarter of the 17th century, when so many homes had been lost to fire, hurricane, termites, and rats, that the Bermuda Company offered land to individuals who would build a house out of stone with a slate roof. These simple limestone buildings came to be known as the Bermuda Cottage. Chimneys were an important feature for cooking and for winter heating. During the summer, wealthy Bermudians followed the Virginia fashion of having a kitchen in a separate building because of the heat, smell, and risk of fire. Also found was a building called a buttery, used for storing food. The high roof reached a point and was usually crowned with a stone ball. Bermuda tray ceilings are famous for their charm and dignity, but the high ceilings help keep the rooms cool. Many farmhouses of the bungalow type were constructed with a below-ground first floor to accommodate livestock, storage, or slaves. The family traditionally lived on the upper level, reached by a sweeping set of stairs known as welcoming arms. Because seawater penetrated the rock, fresh water could not be had from wells. The idea of catching rainwater and leading it into tanks must have come early. Tanks were small with a rounded top of arched construction. This allowed space between the water and the roof, which kept the water fresh. Some houses were adorned with decorative eyebrows of stone projecting from the wall above. Windows were protected from the rain by push-out louvered shutters, and others had interior folding blinds. Although there were some skilled cabinet makers from England, a large portion of the 17th century furniture was homemade. Self-reliance required young men starting out to build their own homes and furniture with the help of family and friends. The best cedar furniture was made from 1612 to 1750 and was often decoratively carved. Houses never had very much furniture, but a bed and trundle beds for children, tables and chairs for dining, and chests for clothes, as there were no closets. Houses were not particularly well planned, and a family starting out would usually keep on adding rooms as their family grew. Two designs dominated Bermuda's residential architecture, and until the 19th century were the only forms used. The farmhouse bungalow was built in rectangular form with wings added on, so the house eventually formed a U configuration. In the latter 17th century, Bermuda's affluence allowed the building of a manor house, which was cruciform in shape and 2 stories high. There was little leisure in Bermuda at the end of the century. All of the early ideas about living in a workless paradise had long since passed. Shipbuilding, carpentry, and farming were the main means of livelihood. Land had been set aside for schools, but after the company era, interest in education waned. Teaching became a second job for the clergy or those who were interested. Bermudians were poor, but they were no beggars or idlers. Records show the population stood at 5,889. Service at arms was required of all able-bodied men, and the militia totaled 778. 8 churches shared 4 ministries, and there were only 579 houses scattered throughout the island. As the 17th century drew to a close, there were lean times, but promise for the future, and it might do well to remember the words of a 17th century governor of these isles.
My lords, I think it would be of no great importance to the Crown of England if there were no such thing as Bermuda. But seeing that Providence has thought fit to place such a spot of ground in so important a situation, the Crown can never take too much care of it.